Welcome to the Seattle Angel Conference workshop series. Today we're talking about outsourcing and doing startup-like things with outsourcing. Let me introduce myself for a second and then I'll get into the speakers. So I'm John Seacrest. My goal is to drive the ecosystem a little bit faster by making more angel investors that write checks and making more companies be fundable. We do open copy, lean startup, the Seattle Angel Conference, startup weekends, and a fund manager peer learning group to try to move people forward faster. We're coming up on the 19th Seattle Angel Conference on May 12th. We will then start Seattle Angel Conference 20 with workshops in June. And so we'll double down with workshops in June for people that are like Nelson at the very beginning, trying to frame everything. We find that often people have an idea and they haven't really thought through how to get from the idea to a functional, profitable business in some strategic manner. It's just sort of dive in and splash in the water and then grab what you can along the way. And so we have three different speakers that come from three different points of view. And I'd like to start with Laura, because I think she represents an important mindset that entrepreneurs might start with. And then we'll go to Yuri and then to Eric about outsourcing in different ways. So Laura, could you do a brief introduction?
Yeah, hi everyone. Glad to be here. My name is Laura Malcolm. I am the founder and CEO of Given Kind. We are a consumer application for organizing support through challenging life moments. But I spent 10 years as a product manager in both very early scale all the way up through public companies. And when it came time to found our own company, we weighed hiring a dev team here in the US against hiring a team offshore, and ended up deciding to make the decision to not only hire an offshore team, but to pack up and go and embed with them 2 different times to bring both our MVP to market and then to come out of beta. And so I have lots of thoughts about how to both find them, interview them, work closely with them at the beginning, and then what you really need to do to be able to keep that relationship. We have 2 of the developers that we hired from the beginning are still with us now 5 years later. One of them became our co-founder, and have seen that team grown now to 4 developers in Chiang Mai, Thailand, where we kicked off the offshore work, 3 developers in Poland, and a growing remote team. You're on mute, John.
Thank you. Yuri, could you introduce yourself and set the frame for your experiences?
I currently live in Seattle, but I moved here 5 years ago, and I do own an outsourcing company. So we would do a lot of the things that that you guys are describing. What's funny is when I first moved here, whoever I talked to had an experience with an outsourcing company, and it was a bad one. So it was quite a wall to climb, but we found a way to make it work both with startups and larger tech companies as well. And in the recent year, we've narrowed our target audience down to healthcare businesses, specifically payers. So and we're currently working there.
Cool, thank you. And Eric, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, you bet. Hi, everybody. Nice to meet you. Eric Watson. Some of you I may know from the Seattle Angel Conference participants. For the rest of you, as it pertains to outsourcing, probably my biggest claim to fame was running a $150 million P&L at Microsoft, responsible for all outsourcing to China. And so, so I ran multiple product teams and liaised between Redmond and China for all of the outsourcing that Microsoft did to China. At a more medium scale, I was involved in a couple of different medium-sized outsourcing companies that had a domestic presence, but primarily based offshore in different countries. And while at those companies, I helped some founders similar to yourselves fully outsource, where literally it was just the founder. The founder was the only, W-2 style employee, and the entire team was offshored. And they sold their companies for several $100 million. So that was a very educational experience. And then all the way to the very low end, where I'm a regular participant, consumer of, and contributor to a variety of online task marketplaces that do very sort of micro outsourcing, if you will, for different things. And so I've got a pretty broad set of experiences that I hope I can share with you today.
Cool, thanks so very much. So the place I sort of want to start is, there's sort of I can do everything feeling that goes on with some entrepreneurs. And so I have this bright idea, and then I'm going to do everything. And so I gather all of the stuff to do a bad job at everything. And so I'd sort of like to frame it around the idea of a Wardley map. Simon Wardley talks about the stages of a technology. And there's some places in that technology where you are contributing innovatively to that kind of thing, whether it's in marketing or in finances or in the technology, there's an innovation there. And then there's a bunch of other things that are commodities. And so my premise in outsourcing is those things that are commodities, or at least near commodities, are probably not things to build inside your company, but things to do outside your company. But almost always the startups are starting with the product. I have an idea, and then I'll do the idea, and then I'll do the other thing. So when we talk about outsourcing, most of the outsourcing experiences that Yuri was engaging with was outsourcing of technical help. So let's find out. How many people here think that they would like to consider for their startup outsourcing at all? Any kind of outsourcing of anything? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6-ish, 7. Okay, and then how many of those are ready to outsource marketing and customer development? 1, 2. And how many of you are trying to outsource the technical development of the product? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And so it seems to me that we have this bias in the market, for the companies. The companies have 4 things they have to do really well. They have to do the technology, whatever the technology is, they have to do that well. They have to go find the people that want to buy the technology and do the market well. They have to do their finances well, whether it's managing financial discipline or doing your financial strategy. And then they have to do the leadership part well, where they manage the culture and do the HR and make that whole process work. So there's 4 places where people can outsource, even if it's outsourcing to a fractional person versus outsourcing to a team somewhere else, or picking up gig workers. So we have a bunch of different ways to do that, right? But what I just heard in this query is most of you are not doing finance or HR culture things as outsourced. Some of you barely are doing marketing, and most of you are doing technical, this is normal, right? This is the pattern that we normally see. Partly because people don't do enough marketing, but partly because they are getting stuck there. So I'd like to dive in a little bit deeper on Laura and her mission, right? Laura had an epiphany, and then she decided to do something about it. So can you start there and sort of dive into how you decided to go on your journey to Chiang Mai?
Yeah, absolutely. So you know, when we knew that we needed to hire development, because I'm a product manager, and my husband, who was taking this journey with us, is a designer. And so our, you know, where that gap in expertise lies is in development. But for us, deciding to make the journey to go to Chiang Mai came from that experience working closely with developers and sort of not yet ready to make that transition to completely doing it remotely, which we could have now, but I would go back and I know that the strengths that you need in order to make that successful. So for us, it was going and being elbow to elbow with that team. What I have learned, and I think that this is a really important skill for us today, and really important when we think about the things that we want to outsource. And when I think about people who have poor experiences outsourcing, which has included us in different areas, I think one of the most important things is an ability to really clearly communicate and articulate your own requirements. And so for me, I felt comfortable having an offshore team, even if I kicked it off in person, because I knew how to write requirements. I think that the biggest point of failure for outsourced teams is this idea that I have this thing in my head and I'm kind of going to convey what it is, but even I have trouble articulating it. And now I have an expectation that you're actually going to be able to see my vision and develop it in some way. If you can't, so it's an excellent exercise for us founders, right? Because if you can't clearly articulate everything that you want your product to do, literally, what happens when somebody clicks on this? What should your users see if it doesn't work? Like all of these nuances of the product, you will never be successful outsourcing that work because you don't want somebody else thinking through it. Chances are they're not going to think through it in the way that you envisioned it in your head. So I think that outsourcing is such a powerful, it's a powerful exercise for founders in that it forces you to really put clarity and thought behind every aspect of your business that can be a little bit fuzzy when the idea is swirling around in our head. I think that compare that to when I think about, I know we're going to dive into some other topics here, right? The other areas that whether or not people are outsourcing, we outsource, we're at a point now where all financial gets outsourced because we have accountants and now a fractional CFO. I don't know anything about what they do, and I don't care how they do it because they do it better than I will ever know how to do it. So that's an area where it's like, I'm happy to outsource because I have no opinion. I know that you're going to deliver what I need in the end. If you have an opinion about your social media, your voice, your tone, your brand, and your product, which you should have the utmost opinion about, then if you want to be successful outsourcing, absolute clarity of requirements. And so again, I felt comfortable doing that because I had that skill. That's a skill that you need to build or find, make sure when you're looking for that team you're going to outsource to, that you have somebody with project management, product management, you have somebody who is being an intermediary between you and that team that you're hiring, because otherwise it will just all fall apart. So I got very lucky in that respect, but it had to come with some baseline level of skill set in articulating ideas. John, you're on mute again. Sorry.
Thank you. Keep doing that. I don't want to get echoed, so that's why I close it down and I'll keep forgetting. So you did something else, which was really important, which is not only did you communicate clearly what your tasks were, but you built a really short feedback loop by going there and living in the same co-working space that they were living in, right? And so that short feedback loop made an enormous amount of difference. And I'm going to come back to that later about why you made that choice. But I want to go to Yuri and talk a little bit about this question of all the people in Seattle had this experience and it was a terrible experience and then you got over it. And so what changed that allowed people to get over it?
Well, usually the problem is that that there's a big cultural difference. There's a time difference, and there's that problem that Laura is talking about of not articulating enough, because people here would make assumptions about, well, everybody knows about this business, everybody knows about this context, but people over, in Ukraine and China, India, they don't know that, right? So that expertise of translating what's in your head or the context of your organization into solid technical requirements, somebody has to do that, right? So I think one way to do it would be to hire a co-founder that is really technical. We, at the beginning of our days, we've had a CTO on the part of the startup who would be really detailed. But that person just, I don't know how he lived. I don't think he slept. He's always was 3 times on the phone back with my team, but really clear instructions. The way we've learned to overcome it is partially why I'm here, is to have the representation for those companies here who can transfer the context, because it's a dance, right? So as a founder, if you have an idea, then it's in your head, but you don't know what can be put down on the screen in your SaaS and software. So you have to find somebody who will tell you, here's what's possible, here's how we can extend that idea. So that interaction needs to happen between like an idea founder and technical person. So the way we're overcoming it is we're doing the business part of the project here. So we're doing all the business analysis, all the research, all the context on the Seattle side, and then translating it into solid solutions to a team in Ukraine. That's number one. And number two is that we've hired a bunch of analysts back in Ukraine as well who would do that kind of work, because translating context, that's a bigger task than we appreciate.
But you also have chosen to make another step, which is you've chosen to specialize as an outsourcing team, and actually specialize relatively narrowly. And so what happens when you specialize that changes the process for you?
Well, it just optimizes everybody's efforts, right? So we went into the healthcare space starting with payers, which means that we had invested our time to understand how payers work, how they interact with patients, members, with providers, which is hospitals, clinics, and whatnot, and how that business works. So now when we get clients, discoveries go a lot faster. The clients trust you a lot more because they see that you understand their language, understand their business, so they trust you more to understand what they're trying to build. It's the big problem in healthcare right now is patient engagement, right? When you're trying to find out what are your accumulators for dental for this year, it's hell to find out. So if you speak the same language as your clients, then that overhead of trying to explain everything and micromanage everything, that goes away, and the partnership becomes a lot more optimal.
Right. So it's not about having the skills to be a programmer. It's about being able to understand the context of the client and then solve their problem in their context. So that's
where the value is, right? So programming becomes a commodity, right? So remember how 10 years ago building a website was a creative task. Right now it's anybody can go on Wix, and do it. So I say that the floor is kind of rising, and you have to step up and you have to say, well, what's the value that we bring as providers? And the value is to understand the context and to build solutions, not just deliver technical deliverables.
Right. Excellent. So Eric, you had experience with outsourcing at a multitude of levels. And so I would sort of like to have you sort of lay out the layers of the different kinds of outsourcing that you've been engaged in and how they might compare and contrast with each other.
Sure. So I guess when you're, depending on the scale of your engagement, obviously at the very smallest level, it can be almost just outsourcing a simple task, right? Well, and so I think Laura earlier alluded to the task of bookkeeping, right? Which is not the simplest of tasks. There's some stuff involved in there, Many of us are comfortable trusting that small task to our CPA or our bookkeeper. And so that's kind of at the micro level. I think as you ratchet up, you start to run into some of the issues that Yuri described, which is as the organization gets bigger and the tasks get more complicated, then having what is typically thought of as a shared corporate culture, imagine that Yuri's organization is going to go build some software, or that Microsoft is going to go build some software. There's a lot of cultural shortcuts that they can take because they share a common understanding about many concepts. And so that allows them to work more efficiently and to resolve any difficulties that may arise more effectively. And so when you're getting into an outsourced relationship, as Yuri described, you're kind of sort of allocating that cultural burden to someone else, right? And then now the stakes have risen. It becomes much more difficult to make sure that your vision of the success is shared with that other organization. And I think Laura pointed this out as well, where she said, "Hey, we're gonna go visit with these guys in Chiang Mai. We're gonna make sure they understand us completely. We're gonna document the heck out of it. We're gonna be really crisp in our written documentation." And that is essential. And quite frankly, the majority of the problems that I've seen arise, regardless of scale, has to do with that having a shared vision of success. And then when you get to the very largest scale, where you have dozens of teams orchestrating with one another, the notions of culture and leadership and sort of driving people to a common set of OKRs and goals becomes even more essential, because in many cases the organization gets so big and dispersed, you're not able to go and build any sort of meaningful relationship with all of them. And so you have to use more traditional leadership tools, things like podcasts for learning and having newsletters and just having a communication strategy about how you're going to get everybody aligned around a shared set of objectives, right? And I think we see this most frequently in the mid-range, and based on the feedback that we've gotten from our audience, I think most of them are either are of some size, or they're thinking about starting from scratch and building something. And I think as someone who is the architect of an organization, you need to think about where all these pieces are going to fit. And just to wrap it up and kind of tie back to your Wardley map, John, I think if you've identified something that's a commodity, whether that's development, application development, or finance, for sure that's much easier to outsource, because you don't have to worry about it as much. But as you go up the value chain, the more things the closer the outsourcing gets, or as Yuri pointed out, the way the floor raises, then that's where most of the friction can occur. And so if you look at the Wardley map and you look at how we're moving up the value chain, the further up you go, the more tension, I think, is created between your organization and your vision and where you're trying to go, and your outsourced partners and how they're engaging with you.
So one of the things that I notice is that the tasks come in sort of optimal size chunks, and there's things you can do with a graphic designer that are small, and then you get a little bit too far, and now you really need to take a bigger bite that's fundamentally a bigger bite with a bigger piece of their time. And as you walk up, you start talking about a whole person for a while, or you start talking about a whole team for a while, and in between there are places where it just doesn't work, right? So can we talk a little bit about what kind of sizes of outsourcing actually produce results? So Laura, let's start with you. When you started, did you start giving people little tiny things, or did you just design the whole thing and then go to Chiang Mai? You're on mute.
Classic. So we jumped right in with that team because we had the skill set on our team, like I said, to sort of do the product, do the design and marketing, and then bring in the dev team. So, we jumped in whole go, which I think is very different from if you're working with a technical and a non-technical sort of traditional founding team. But since then, we have done a lot of outsourcing and continue to, even as now we're over $2 million in funding raised, and we still are we're 6 FTEs in the US, 6 full-time offshore developers, and 6 part-time contractors here in the US. So sort of how we comprise our team today. And so we still lean on outsourcing pretty heavily. Some of that is offshore, and some of that is here in the States. So I actually think that for us, now we have my co-founder who's based in Chiang Mai, but who now I'm, sharing that his superpower really is the ability to pull in highly specialized technical resources for discrete chunks of work. And for us, the ability to pull in will be like, wow, we have some work we need to do on our, WordPress to .NET integration, and how we, it's a discrete project where you would be searching for a long time to find a resource that could do this, and then you have to hire them. We can pull in these projects of work. So on the technical side, we absolutely are doing discrete projects, which has been to our financial advantage. And we do it on the marketing side as well. Where there is, I come back to, right, where you don't want to have to convey a full strategy, right? You have to sort of like look at the ROI and the amount of time that you spend investing into an outsourced resource. So for us to convey a brand strategy or our tone and voice across a longer term marketing initiative takes getting somebody really up to speed on who you are, and they have to sit in the brand and understand the message they're trying to convey. That's harder to outsource. Then we have a Hubspot landing page designer that we found on Upwork. We'll go back to him every time, because for $300, he builds fully functional landing pages on Unbounce. That's a discrete project that we can chip off. So I think that but we also have long-term outsource in social media, in paid search. Like all of those are fractional resources that do discrete projects. So I think we do it both ways. We do all of it on a long-term contract basis and these projects.
So a bunch of us have used Fiverr.
Hey, how's it going? Good.
Stuff.
Hey,
Let me
House of
make
Brick.
Robert a little bit quieter.
I'm thinking we should get them involved.
Sorry about that. So we have people that have done the Fiverr thing, and my experience with the Fiverr thing is that it's somewhat terrible. You go find people, they have a hammer, they beat with that hammer, and if what you want isn't actually a nail, then you still get whatever it is beaten with the hammer they have. And so it actually takes you significant research work for you to find someone that has the skills that will do what you want, whether that's Fiverr or Upwork or even an agency at some level, right? And so how did you come to the conclusion that going to Chiang Mai and doing the work there was going to actually fit the bill versus, going to Mexico or using a local person? It felt like you evaluated Seattle gig workers against Chiang Mai gig workers. And I'm sure there's a bigger context than that. And I'd like you to dive into that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, in that case, there was a balance of budget and budget, not just in actually hiring the team, but in the ability to go and bootstrap. We had at that time, the first time that we went to Chiang Mai, we had an 18-month-old child. And so when we were evaluating where to go and work in-house with a dev team, Thailand kept coming up in Chiang Mai specifically as actually being a really great place to go and be family friendly. We, the team and John just linked to the dev team that we hired there, actually owned by a Finnish gentleman, I believe. And so they tapped into both not just Thai developers, but they had a lot. Chiang Mai is a digital nomad hub, and or was. When digital nomads were, could travel the world. And I think that 5 years ago, there was really a growing culture around that world travelers working. And that's how we learned about going to Thailand. We had a friend who was working as a developer in Bangkok. And so it was just a good place to go where we could afford to live with our family and have an adventure. We ended up going back in the beginning of 2019, frankly, because we had run out of money to keep self-funding in kind. We bootstrapped it for nearly 3 years, and it was, could have been death by slow growth, which I actually think is one of the toughest positions for founders to find themselves in, right? A few more users, maybe some customers, couple of warm investor conversations, but nobody's telling you, right, that your baby is ugly. And we had to make a decision because now I had 2 kids and we were paying the same amount for daycare for 2 kids as we were for developers. And so it literally was like a developers or daycare decision. And we chose developers. And so we packed up now 2 kids and we went back to Chiang Mai because, you can eat for $1 a day and get the kind of support that you can't get in the US. And we came out of beta and did the last push there with another 4 months in-house with our team. And we immediately hit, that early product market fit. It started doing 20% month over month growth. Couldn't yet afford to come back to the US. So we were in this catch-22 because now we have customers, we have users, it's really growing fast. The investor conversations are picking up, but we need a few more months of traction. And, but I needed to be on US time zone because Thailand is a plus 14 hours to us. So it's opposite and it's very difficult to schedule to be there for your customers, your users or investors. But we still didn't have any money. And so we decided to go to Merida, Mexico, so that we could be on a US time zone. We could still afford to live. And I flew back and forth from Mexico up here until we got our first angel check in the bank. And then our family could come home. So it was, a combination of factors in that case. I think that for us, Thailand was a great choice because it's not just, and I have an off the side conversation with Jeff about experience in Thailand as well. Only one of our developers is Thai. So they have a very international community there in Thailand. So our developers in Thailand are Polish. They're from New Zealand. We've had them from a Portuguese developer. So there is such a culture of tech workers there. Chiang Mai University is also, I believe, the largest university in Thailand and has a pretty strong CS program. And so compared to some of the other outsourcing hubs, it made sense for us. But again, now we have a growing developer population in Poland, in the Ukraine. And so there's certainly lots of places that you can outsource from. For us, it was that win-win of being able to go and work elbow to elbow with them. So
people don't usually get to stay 18, 20 months in a country just because they decided to go there. Can you talk just a little bit about why you were able to stay past the 90-day mark?
Oh, so we came back. So we went twice and we did 4 months the first time, 3 months the second time. And we went in on tourist visas each time. So I know you're recording this, but we went in on tourist visas and we left and we took an opportunity. We did not overstay a tourist visa. We took an opportunity each time to explore. Once you're there in Thailand, it's a hop for a weekend to Vietnam, another growing tech outsourcing resource, another hop to Cambodia. went to Indonesia. So it was an opportunity also to explore Southeast Asia. You also can go and get a tourist visa extended while you're there.
But the miracle piece about Igloo that I wanted to bring up is that they will do a contract with you where they hire you directly and basically become your employer of record in Thailand. And then you are a resident of Thailand. And so you can stay there for a while. So there's some magic there that you don't generally get at other tech hubs, which is important. I know that Uriel wishes that I would talk a little bit more about Mexico and South America as possible places to do outsourcing. So why Chiang Mai instead of Mexico?
Great question. I mean, I think that we didn't interview shops in Mexico, and I have talked to companies in Latin America and Mexico now, as we have looked at extending our offshore resources. I mean, I think, again, in that point, and I speak enough Spanish to have been able to actually, you know, if I felt like that, I mean, I don't think that was a limitation for us at all. I think we are now looking at more US-based time zones and extending our offshore team through Mexico and Latin America. So that will be where we go next, and those definitely are really good hubs for that.
Cool. So Uriel, you have done a bunch of projects where the teams were various different sizes when they hired you. Can you talk a little bit about in the early days when you were trying to get over this hump of how you solve the value for Seattle teams? Could you articulate what you did with that? Yuri?
Oh, sorry. I thought we were talking to Uriel.
No.
Oh, sorry, but go ahead.
No, I was talking to Yuri. Talk a little bit about how you approached the first set of customers that were in Seattle who had this bad taste in their mouth, and how you got, you know, what's the, you know, I have this sense that there's sort of a minimum size, that if the startup is not willing to spend X amount of money, that they're not really a client.
Correct. So with us, we wanted to remove as many perceived risks from a client's plate as much as we could. So first few clients I got from referrals, and we had a US company registered, and I was here, and I had a couple of PMs on site here that were working. We went to personal meetings. We talked about how we approach things, how we're different, and why this time, you know, why we're not like, you know, the others. Big part of that was that our pitch was that we always understand what the business is. To us, your product is not just another set of tasks. We're not, you know, just doing them one by one. We're trying to understand what the product is, what the value prop, who the customers are, how they will be using the product, and all of those things. And that builds confidence, because I think when a client or startup founder, they're seeing that you understand not only what they're trying to do technically, but also where you're trying to get business-wise, that builds a lot of trust. So that was really important in the beginning. And then my proposition was always, you know, give us something small. Because I realized that especially for established companies, like we did a bunch of work for Amazon and whatnot, companies will never outsource their core product, right? You know, Microsoft is never gonna do, you know, their OS outside the company. So what you're gonna get at most is, you know, peripheral work or something that is more or less autonomous. There is ways, for example, here in Seattle, a company, what's the company that's tracking investment? Keep forgetting.
PitchBook.
PitchBook. So PitchBook, their entire development is in my hometown in Ukraine, right? So there are models where your sort of core product is done by an outside agency, but mostly you're trying to leverage, the cost there. So so it's important for the outsourcing company to understand where this client is going with their business goals. And then everything else goes from there, because that also opens doors for us to start do some consulting. Because when you get a vision, here's how we're trying to build a product, here's how it's going to work, here's how these buttons going to work. But when you understand where the client is trying to get, you can say, well, did you know there's a better way to do it, because you have that expertise built up. So that helped a lot. And then as we were, growing our work here, and word of mouth and whatnot, that helped quite a bit as well.
So what's an example of a successful small project for a startup that people can sort of wrap their heads around, what size thing they need to focus on when they get their startup thing going?
I would say a good way to leverage an outsourced company and use that cost benefit is to build an MVP that you will throw away, right? If you want to prove a concept, have them build it, because you're not losing that much out of the gate. I would say that as a risk mitigation strategy, have some sort of plan that the technical knowledge of your product will stay within your company in one way or another. For example, Laura was talking about that one of their tech leads is now co-founder. That's a great way to keep the knowledge in-house and things like that. So, but when the risk to you is low, how Richard Branson is always saying, make sure that you're maximizing your upside and protecting your downside. So in that sense, have them build some proof of concept that you can take a look at and throw away, right? If it proves well, okay, good. Then you can do more. For some projects that are going on for years, I know some of my sub teams, the client is not checking in with them for like a month, because there's so much context there, so much trust, so much conversation going. Sorry, not conversation, but so much context that they know what they need to build. They do a check-in once a month, commit, merge, and go on.
Yeah, so I'm trying to get an example of a small thing, right? Doing a 1 week MVP to test an idea, right? Throw Wix in here, put this database there, put in that image, get 1,000 people to it, see if it works, kind of startup weekendy kind of thing.
So
what's the smallest one of those that actually produced results?
Are you looking for like an example of such work?
Yeah, that one that worked for you. How far down the stack did you end up coming in terms of being able to do a small problem for someone?
Okay, so I remember an example. We were doing work for Chewy. They were called Mr. Chewy back then, but basically they were trying to set a competitive price for their product. So they had us build scrapers that would go out into like Amazon, Petco, and Target and stuff like that, and get prices on their product so that they can dynamically change them. So that was a relatively quick project. We did it for them, and then we ended up taking over the tech for that operation for price management for them. So that was a good example.
Yeah, cool. So Eric, you had experience with an outsourcing company where you were consulting with them and doing support for outsourcing, where you actually saw someone be the only founder who outsourced everything, right? Can you talk about that structure a little bit?
Yeah, their experience was very similar to what Laura described. It happened to be in Nepal instead of in Chiang Mai, but it could have just as easily been in Mexico or Argentina or anywhere else in the world. And what it boiled down to was this company was building an application in service to a business that was not a technology business. It was really about customer relationships. The core of the business was about customer relationships with hospitals, and they were a a workforce planning and management tool for nurses. And so I didn't know this until I got involved with them, but basically there are these things called traveling nurses, where you're a licensed nurse and you're not assigned to a specific hospital or a specific clinic. You just kind of float around in a given geography and go wherever. And this was pre-COVID. So they were discovering that people who, and probably Bob could tell us more about this being a physician, but they were discovering that a lot of these nurses were really burning the candle at both ends. They were experiencing burnout. They were having difficulty managing their schedules between one location and another location. So they built software to solve that problem. And they lined up customers who, in this case, were large medical institutions. And those customer relationships were very sticky. And so that was the core value proposition that the company was based on. And the fact that they happened to use software in order to enable all of these different use cases that I just described was sort of, it became commodity, right? So in this example, I think many of us in Seattle, because Seattle is such a software town, a lot of us think of software as being the product. And, we have to own the product and we have to manage the product very assiduously. And in this example, it was a very highly successful, highly profitable business, sold for multiple hundreds of millions of dollars. And really the value in the business that led to the successful exit was all tied up in the customer relationships, the customer contracts, actually. And so it was the fact that they had this technological capability was almost an afterthought. It could have been done by a wide variety of different kinds of software. And the fact that they happened to have outsourced the development to this foreign country and built a team that they were very close with, and as Laura pointed out, made routine visits in person, tried to build a common shared culture with that team, and then when the exit came around, that team all got a nice little parting bonus, and they were off to the next engagement, right? And so, and meanwhile, the owners of the company, called in rich, so to speak, right? And so, so I think this ties back to your Wardley diagram very, very keenly, because you have to be very clear on what the value is. And if the value is not in software, then software can be outsourced just as easily as accounting and bookkeeping, right? So if the value is in software, and that's where a lot of friction sometimes happens, is a software business where the value is built into the software. Those businesses have one part or all of their development outsourced. That's a recipe for conflict a lot of times, because the founders have one vision and they're trying to take it in one direction, and the development team is having difficulty following, right? And so, as Laura pointed out in her description, unless you're a really good writer and you can articulate your needs very crisply in a way that a person from a foreign culture can understand and interpret correctly, you're going to struggle. And so that's why folks like Yuri and Uriel have a valuable service to offer when they can bridge that gap, right? But that's the gap that I think a lot of people are in danger of falling into if they're not careful.
Right. And so there's this sort of outsource by doing gig work with Upwork. Mm-hmm. And then there's outsource a roadmap with a group. Mm-hmm. And those are fundamentally different things. And in between there is this zone of death, where yes, your projects are too big for gigs and too small for the other ones. So this is like any normal business, right? As your business is growing, you go from cash flow positive, cash flow negative to positive, negative. As you move through these zones, the projects do the same things, right? Mm-hmm. And so what you're trying to do with the startup and driving things, if it's not small experiments, then you have to build enough fat in your system so that you can drive the roadmap and commit to driving the roadmap, which is a big chunk. We're not, this is numbers of zeros on the checks that you're writing that changes, right? And so you're not going to do $100 gigs for things that are build my roadmap, essentially. Does that continue as you go all the way up into the Microsoft Chinese outsourcing world, where there's gaps, where the project is too big for one group and too small for another, and it's not going to work as an outsourced thing?
the gaps just get bigger and bigger because then they involve more people and more disparate groups. As a simple anecdote, when Microsoft was setting up a lot of their outsourced teams in China, they had to sign a 99-year lease for a very large office park in downtown Beijing, which cost like $90 million. And at the time of the lease signing, we didn't have any butts in seats to put it in the building. So there was a huge scramble to try to get tenants in the building who would pay the lease of the building to get, and that's just kind of a simple, almost comical example. But that's what I mean when the gaps get bigger and the difficulty increases in scale, basically.
So changing the topic around a little bit, Eric, you were the SAC 18 fund manager.
Mm-hmm.
You write angel checks. So you get somebody like Chad coming in as the lone guy, and he's outsourced his marketing and he's outsourced his technical and he's outsourced everything. He's just got a great idea. Maybe he's got some good, unique value proposition in his contracts. How do you as an investor look at this outsourcing thing?
Yeah, I think it's smart so long as the things being outsourced are truly commodity, right? So if you're very clear that those things that are being outsourced are not what's driving the value of your business, whatever that value, whatever the source of that value may be, then you're safe, right? Then outsourcing is just another one of many business decisions that a business founder may need to take, right? Where I see a lot of conflict and a lot of grief and trouble is when a part of the primary value proposition, or let's say the atomic value proposition of the business, gets partially or fully outsourced. Then that's kind of a non-starter, right? Because even if the business were to achieve commercial success, you don't have your arms around it in such a way that it can be monetized, right? That it can be transferred to another owner, let's say, or go public or be bought or whatever, right? So when that's the case, that's always a red flag, and it's an indication that the founder maybe has some confusion or lack of clarity around what their true value proposition is and what the true function of their business is. And it's especially sticky when your value proposition is tied up into a software product that does a unique thing, because then it becomes very challenging to be able to disentangle which parts of that product or product suite are commodity and which parts are really secret sauce and special and bring value to the organization. And then it becomes not just a technology discussion, but also a corporate structure discussion. Like, how are you building this business from a structural standpoint, not just the technology standpoint, to be able to be subsumed by another corporation, let's say, or to be acquired, for example? Is that something that you're ready for, that can be successfully executed against? And if the answer is no, because your brain trust is in another country that you have no control over, you're in trouble, right? That's a problem.
Right.
I can actually jump in and speak a little bit, if you'd like, John, just sort of add on to what Eric said, because that was an uphill battle that we had to climb in getting investment for sure. The conversations out of the gate were, we were outsourced, and not even our most senior developer and architect was not full-time. And then he was a part-time co-founder, and then. And so it really took, we were able to raise our pre-seed on the idea that Andy, my co-founder, would be joining us full-time, and really positioning that for us, it was a strength that we were able to pull in these resources like I talked about, and be flexible, and have accomplished a lot on a limited budget, limited resources. So we definitely tried to leverage that to our advantage. When we raised, there was a question from a lot of investors here about if we were going to be hiring a CTO here that would be leading the technology from here in the US. What we were able to do at that point was actually not to bring on a CTO, but we brought on Arjen van Wielen, who was the CTO co-founder of OfferUp, as an advisor. Arian has a lot of experience also working with offshore teams. So he meets with my co-founder and our head of product on a bi-weekly basis. So now we're able to sort of show, like, not only do we continue to build this really strong technical team, we can reassure our investors here that Arian is checking in regularly on how we're thinking about scaling the technology. And again, so now we're heading into our next fundraise, and we're actually not getting pushback about our technology team being offshore, being outsourced whatsoever, because I think that the best thing that you can do when these questions around investment come is to demonstrate, right? To show how you're thinking about it, why you've thought about it in that way, have a really good answer, and be able to position something as your strength, as opposed to being defensive about it being your weakness. And that has absolutely worked to our advantage. So I think that it is possible, right? But you have to show, again, why it's a decision that you are choosing to make, and how it'll turn out advantageous in the long run.
So yeah, I think that the whole notion of technical and business is the core team, and we want a core team that covers that, and we have that bound inside our company, is sort of a true belief among a lot of investors. And in Seattle in particular, technology first is a bias, I think. And so I think that gets in our way in a couple of scenarios. And so when we look at this process of being a startup and growing the company as it goes, and then, here you are, Laura, working on your Series A, trying to get to the point where you're going to have people in many, many time zones and managing that process. I think it was Carol that asked about how do I schedule who I hire where in that growth pattern, right? 20% growth month over month often translates into very rapid hiring as well. Any stories there you want to share?
Yeah, and actually I was just going to throw in the chat, but this is going to answer a question, I think, for Bob as well, about setting up short feedback loops. And I do the talk that I linked to sort of higher up in the chat that I did for the Bellevue earlier in COVID about managing remote teams, covers a lot of this about short feedback loops and how you think about who to hire when. It's difficult, and for a very long, that's the honest answer. For a long time, I was on a 10 p.m. stand-up every night, and blessed be the day that I hired a head of product who's a night owl, and he takes those stand-ups now twice a week, and I'm not doing them, but we still have to have nighttime meetings. It's it's hard on our leadership team that now most of us in the US have to do a 4 to 6 p.m. leadership team call, because that's the only time our co-founder can realistically start a 6 a.m. call in Chiang Mai. When you think about, that's a huge advantage to looking to Latin America, even looking in Eastern Europe, where you're talking about a 8-hour difference, 10-hour difference. So what we have now is we have a staggered team, so that our developers in Chiang Mai, there is some hours of overlap that they can have their team meetings with the Eastern Europe team. And then we have developers that are still online for a few hours when we come online in the morning, so that we sort of know what those hours are going to be. Depending on who you're working with where, you have to set a regular cadence for meeting, trying to catch each other, right? Or even know that, like, oh, you'll send a message on Slack. Setting regularly scheduled times at a time that works for everyone is one of the most important things. You can always ditch a meeting if you don't need it, but you want everyone to make sure that they're available so that you can have that cadence of check-in. Going more than a week without talking to someone on your team is too long. And it's really easy when we were talking about those sort of bigger projects, and going weeks without talking to a client, like that is just recipe for design. I mean, that's the kind of feedback loop where you are not checking in on making sure that somebody isn't driving down the wrong path entirely. So lots of communication tools for asynchronous communication, whether you're doing things in Slack, you're recording videos in Loom to talk to your team. Everybody on our team's in Notion now, making sure we're using project tracking. You know, for us, it's Jira. If you're doing it in Trello, like, you need to have lots of tools to make sure that that asynchronous communication is super clear. And then you absolutely need to carve out regular time to have synchronous communication, even if it's at times that are more difficult for everyone.
So I'm acutely aware of a couple of companies that are manufacturing companies that outsource manufacturing to Asia, and as a consequence, fundamentally killed their company, right? And the fundamental reason that happened was they didn't have a QA mechanism that was short enough. And so you fill a shipping container full of product, it's broken product, you've just, cost yourself a whole ton of money, and it's going to be months and months and months of work to clean that up. And they killed themselves in less than 6 months over that. And so none of us here, except perhaps Jason Kerfess, are trying to outsource manufacturing. But I think that the same problem exists in software, where your quality control loops, whatever they have to be, really need to be short. And if you haven't figured out what that is, one of the answers for factories is you put one of your staff members at the factory. One of the answers for software is to go there. And then as you get bigger and bigger, you have sort of a network that goes worldwide, which I think is the next step for Laura. So, did I lose Eric? Looks like I lost Eric. So, Yuri, your team is primarily Ukraine. Do you end up having time zone issues?
Yeah, there are always time zone issues. So I go back there every 2 to 3 months to just keep tabs on the business, and everybody's doing well. But in terms of projects, we had set up those windows. In the morning, it's usually anywhere from early morning here up until 10 a.m. when we do status updates, reporting, that type of thing. So there are ways to mitigate that so that you're not on an hour long or stand-ups every day. We're using tools extensively. We use Asana a lot to do reporting, email, and we have, with each of the clients, we have cadences of when we do stand-ups, reporting, and demos, right? So I think the best tool here to overcome the time zone difference is setting expectations, because if there's no expectations, everybody wants to check in as often as possible. But if you're saying, well, we're having demos every 2 weeks on this day, then everybody knows, okay, they know what to expect, and everybody is sort of at ease about having different time zones.
So I see Ken has a question here about what are the risks associated with outsourcing software dev?
I can answer one of those. One of the risks, can I speak? One of the challenges that I see, working as a nearshore software agency alternative, it's the property laws between the U.S., intellectual property laws. I believe that because we have the Canada, U.S., and Mexico agreement, that's just displays a lot. We match a lot. Our laws are similar to the U.S. The another advantage in the nearshore is just the proximity to the U.S. Like we're 7 minutes away from San Diego. We're like 2 hours away from LA, 3 hours on a flight to San Francisco. It makes it a lot smoother. But I believe one of the main problems or challenges where customers come to us is because of the what I mentioned, the intellectual property laws that are close to the U.S.
Yeah, I think it's true that having agreements about intellectual property is probably a worthwhile thing. Yuri, how does that work with the team in Ukraine?
We had not had many concerns regarding IP because the contracts we sign, it's work for hire. It's pretty easy, and there is no conflict of interest that anybody in Eastern Europe would want to keep the IP. In the space that we have chosen, there are more restrictions like HIPAA, for example. So anytime you're dealing with personal identifiable information, that information has to be scrubbed. Before you can ship it off anywhere. So that there are workarounds like that that has to happen here, and then you have to VPN in to transfer data and whatnot. More general risks are quality is a big one. Second one is understanding the business domain, because especially if you're talking about a nuanced product, you want to take advantage of a hole you see in the market, but that is very nuanced. How do you explain that to an Eastern European development team? There's a disparity in risks between whether this is a number of freelancers or a team, right? So a team is more safe to work with, and there is QA, there is some kind of project management, some kind of business analysis. Freelancers are they're one man shop, so you have to do a lot more micromanagement and communication with them.
So I'd like to open it up to questions for people. Do anyone have any particular question you'd like to ask Laura or Yuri? I am not currently seeing Eric on the call anymore. So any questions? Bob, you're doing a software startup?
Actually, software and hardware, and that's one of the things that that not necessarily that we're struggling with, but I have in the back of my mind that we don't have anybody that's placed in India. That's where it's being developed. But the folks that we hire there is actually a company that does both software and hardware development in the health tech space. So they're already established, and some of their founders actually did schooling here in the United States. So there was a certain level of comfort there. But somewhere in the back of my mind too, if something goes wrong, it's easy to drive to work to see what's wrong. But so that's why we're kind of in that gray area where there's some trust there, and we do have weekly meetings, but it's hard to have 100% surety that you're going to get what you get, especially when it's a big product.
So I think it's really important to understand what Eric was saying earlier about what you can outsource and what you can't outsource. If you're outsourcing to someone because it's a commodity, then it's a supply chain issue, right? And if I'm buying screws, it doesn't matter where I buy the screws, but I surely want to have more than one manufacturer that does that. And so if you're doing outsourcing of software dev, you should be able to find another group and another group, at least 3 other groups that can do that kind of work, and that you have enough of a relationship with that you could hand pieces off to. And in fact, you might choose to take your project and divide it up into pieces and spread it over a couple of different groups so that you have this fallback pattern, right? And if you're in a position where you start outsourcing the pieces of this thing and you can't move it to someone else with simply an agreement change, it really isn't a commodity, right?
True.
So you have to think about what pieces are commodity and which pieces are core critical components. And when there's a whole industry 4.0 conversation I just saw, which drives that question around. Yuri, your background is terrible. You need to be mute. So if you've got criticality in your supply channel, you need to resolve that and get rid of it, right? And criticality is there's something here that only one vendor can provide, and then all of a sudden something happens to that vendor, like COVID, and they decide to shut down, like is currently happening for a Boeing airplane part manufacturer. If they don't have other manufacturers that can build that part, they're in trouble, right? So you have that same criticality. Yes, Uriel, very quickly, since your background is hard.
Yes, sorry, I muted it. But...
You had a question.
No, I don't. I'm
Okay.
sorry. I was fixing my earbud. Sorry.
Any other thoughts?
One of the things that I'm sorry. One of the things that we're doing here in Tijuana, we're not only getting close, we're getting close to other agencies as well. We want to expand. We want to grow Mexico as an alternative. You know, we want to build the Mexico Silicon Valley, if you want to say. But the talks that we had with other agencies is not for us to see each other as competitors. You know, it's as, you know, getting united and show the talent that we can offer to other countries. You know, one of the cons from being nearshore in Mexico is that we're not like, I don't want to call it, so I believe that offshore is less expensive than us, you know, but we're also a lot cheaper than the US. We're probably 30–40% in programming cost. You know, but I think that's one of the challenges that we're facing right now is just like getting the companies united, and that way we can show more power. And I mean, there's work for everyone, but that's kind of what we're working on right now, getting close to other agencies and other people that build software in Mexico, not only in the borderlines, but across Mexico. Guadalajara, Monterrey, Mexico City, they have amazing talent as well. And we're bringing our talent from different places. And so, you know, we hope that in the future, in the near years, you know, people are going to see us as a strong alternative for nearshore or outsourcing.
So one of the things that I've looked at, you know, Laura was very fortunate to be able to have international workers who basically their language was English. And so you have people from Poland and Ireland and places, but they're in Chiang Mai. So they're doing all their work in English. Going to Ukraine, I explored some outsourcing to North Africa for a client once. And we fundamentally couldn't make the deal work because the developer spoke French and the client did not. And there was no bridge mechanism to get across the language. So can Yuri and Laura, can you talk a little bit about where language got in your way?
Sure, I can start. Language is a problem. So speaking English is one, but then understanding spoken English is different. Meaning like idioms and how people would make metaphors and allegories and stuff like that. That is important. So one of the bigger things that we do internally within our company is we make sure that everybody has a good spoken and written English, because I don't see how anything can be done without it. There's no level of confidence between the client and when you have to have an interpreter on the call, like especially on a discovery call, that looks really stupid. So so that English is something that we've been focusing on for a long time. We have a few in our hometown, a few people who from the States, from England, who live there for different reasons. So we've been inviting them to practice speaking and stuff like that. So, and that's a solvable problem, but definitely something that needs to be out of the way early.
Yeah. So yeah, Laura, any language problems?
Minimal. Again, I think that while, you know, we aren't English as a first language for the majority of our technical team, everybody is very strong. I would actually go back to saying that I wouldn't mind if we had even people who didn't where their English language was not as strong, if we had a really good central project manager. And I actually think that is just really your key to to being successful with outsourcing any sort of project where you're working with multiple outsourced resources on one thing is that you have one person that you communicate to, right? You don't want it to be a game of telephone, but it's also easier than you trying to manage multiple resources if they're all working in the same time zone on the same project. Have one really trusted project manager who can understand the nuances in the things that you ask. For us, any challenges have been so minimal. It's like if you find yourself on a 404 screen or some of the breadcrumbs throughout the site are, you might go, oh, well, that was an interesting choice of language there because it's text that was not provided. Again, right, that's where just a real clarity in requirements comes in, right? If you want to make sure that all of your error messaging is 100% how you would say it, then you need to provide it. But no, not particularly. And again, I think the most important thing is to find a person that you can super clearly communicate your needs and requirements with, and that'll set you up for success.
So this last year, we had this nasty bit where traveling wasn't really possible. So did the COVID border barriers change your business at all?
Not for us. I don't know that we would have, I don't know if we would have traveled necessarily in this last year anyways, but I tell you, the thought of doing an on-site back in Thailand this winter is what's keeping just about everybody going right now. So we need to hope that the borders open up and we've hit a stage where it merits that. But for us, the teams weren't cross-pollinating beforehand anyways, but hitting a point where for us after 5 years together and now our Poland team, having been with us for over a year and not met any of the other developers, it's time to put people together. I think that's an important piece for culture, and you have to think about for company culture, right? You have to think about how to bring people together. I think I'll have to do a pretty strong defense on why it makes more sense for the entire team to go to Thailand than it does to bring anybody to the US without showing my cards and why that's the goal.
Yes, indeed. So Yuri, did anything change for you with COVID?
Not really. We were distributed this entire time. So I couldn't travel for about 6 months because just no planes were flying. But I've been going pretty regularly starting October last year. And it's just a little bit more hassle with having to do testing all the time. But other than that, it's business as usual.
Interesting. So I see Jeff is bringing up politics and how politics changes the world. We have some saber rattling in Ukraine. Is that changing anything for you?
Yeah, well, it's been saber rattling for the last 70 years. In the beginning, we were worried about Russia trying to invade large parts of Ukraine, but by now I think the status is called frozen conflict. So it's a diplomatic battle. The line is not moving anywhere. So we have long ago, maybe in 2015, started worrying about what it might do. It looks like nothing. Actually, Ukraine is developing very much economically, and there's, I think it's like 45% of Ukraine that's currently being occupied. But other than that, you wouldn't know it if you were like in central Ukraine where we are.
Okay, so I know that the border crossing has messed up Europe substantially. People can't get into Europe like they used to. If you've got a US passport, Europe is off the table. And so there's a certain amount of the distribution and outsourcing and travel that's messed up. Before we get to the end of this, I want to make sure that Carol has a chance to ask questions about HR and all of that HR piece of the thing. Carol, any questions you have?
I actually have a couple of dev questions first, and that is, let's say we decide on a region or a country that we are comfortable with. How do we go about starting to source teams there?
So you're thinking like, I want to go to Mississippi and hire a team there?
No, I'm thinking like, we decide that we're gonna we're gonna try and use dev teams in South and Central America, how do we go about starting to find those resources that are trustworthy and that people have had good experiences with? Can't really go in
Laura, why
Yelp for
don't
that.
you start with how you decided to do interviewing of teams?
Yeah, so in our case, I looked on Google, and then I reached out to some dev shops, and then did Skype interviews. And that worked out okay for us. Now today, I am pretty active in a number of different female founder communities in Facebook, and there's a lot of sharing of resources there and recommendations of offshore teams. So there's one group called the Women Founders Community, parentheses, largest women founders group on Facebook or something like that. You'll see it, it has like 8,000 members. That is a question that comes up, and there are a lot of good referrals, and people will also proactively refer a dev team that they're working with in one country or another. But you can go and look for, if you have a particular country that you're targeting or area, just start looking for dev shops. I think that, and again, we interviewed one in Colombia recently, and they have a really big web presence. They have samples to a lot of client work. They have clients that you can speak with. They were obviously a very well-run, large shop. And so I think that you're interviewing them in the same way that you would be, looking at any resource project today, right? Do they show client work? Are they willing to provide client testimonials? Do they have a really thoughtful, estimation process? The one that we did not end up hiring, actually not for Given Kind, but for a nonprofit tech project that I'm on the board for, we needed an app built, and this company did a full, broke out how they were going to do all the sprints. And that was as a part of their estimation process so that they could give us a reasonable quote. And you were able to see, right, here's the work that they were going to accomplish on every one of those sprints. And it did they ended up being way more expensive than that was going to be $100,000 app, which is a little bit crazy for me, but you could see the number of resources that they were going to put on it, how much, and at that point, some of the investment that you're making is in where estimation is their skill set, right? I think that it's a lot easier to be more flexible, like with a technical team here, or your co-founder, someone who codes, right? They might be a little bit more reluctant to estimate. I think that's kind of an art and both an art and a skill that some dev teams are good at. I think that any team that you're hiring as an external resource should be able to put their finger on at least some sort of rough estimate and what those deliverables and pieces of work are going to look like. So I think, if you any reputable dev shop you're going to look for anywhere else in the world should be able to have some of the same presence and deliverables that you would be expecting for any contracting company anywhere.
Okay, and then another question is, do you think you sacrifice time, like turnaround time, for the cost being lower?
Yes. 100%. Because I sacrifice turnaround time with having a remote team, period, because there is just I think that it is, there's a lot of tools that have been, rolled out in the last year, right, to even deal with the fact that everybody left their offices. So anytime that you are not walking over to somebody's desk to review something or know where they are, catching them on their way back from the bathroom, you're missing time, right? People inevitably miss a Slack message, they miss a call, you don't see it, the email goes unknown. And when you're dealing with a time difference also, that is a trade-off that you are making, because feedback loops are what I don't think that the time is lost in the work. The time is lost in waiting for feedback.
Okay.
Because if you're 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, and you have a decision to make, you can block a developer all day, right? Because you sent them a message that they see at 8:30 a.m. They don't understand. They don't want to go forward. You've lost a day's work. But I think that is the trade-off that you make. We couldn't, there's no way that we could have had US-based developers at the fair cost and gotten our company to the point that it is today. So that was a trade-off that we made in it, and it worked for us.
Would you say it's like 150% the amount of time? Like, what if you could put your finger on how much longer it takes, what would your estimate be?
Well, I tell everyone that any project you undertake is going to take 3 times as long and cost 3 times as much as you estimate. Building technical projects is like remodeling your kitchen. Like if you come in on time and on budget, you've exceeded expectations. So I think that it's hard to put my finger on it. Maybe it takes 30% more time, but that's when you're talking about in those early phases, right? Where you are needing to do that feedback loop in that way. Now that we have a full team working there and processes and cadence and this like waterfall of time zones, I don't think that we lose hardly any time at all. But if it's you working with a dev resource that's in another time zone, but if you're looking through South and Latin America and you're just a few hours off, maybe here or there, then I actually think that you can do enough things to keep cadence. I know a remote team where they were based in the US, and the developers just had an open Google Hangout all the time. And the devs stayed in there, and then people could pop in and out and jump in to ask a question. That really worked for them. They were all co-located internal teams. And so I think that just if you have that regular cadence and check-in and Slack channels and things like that, and you're on the same time zone, you're going to lose less time then.
Okay, and one final question about dev. Is there some sort of like, can someone give me an idea of like cost per region? Like, are we going to find the least expensive in, Vietnam and Thailand, and then Ukraine, and then Mexico, and then the US? Like how would they rank cost-wise? Anybody?
Where should I go to find the cheap ones? Is that what you just said?
Well, yeah, but I mean, there's trade-offs, right? So if we go to in the time zone, we're going to pay more, but like, is it substantially more? Or is it a little bit more?
Let's back up a second. Laura, you said we couldn't have done this without outsourcing. It's a fundamental cost issue about the resources we had, and it was a requirement. What order of magnitude are we talking about? Are you half the price, 1/10 the price? How much do you think you would have needed in Seattle to do it with homegrown people versus what you did?
I think that we were at probably 25% of the cost to start, but we probably had more junior resources than we needed to begin with. Now our most senior developers make what an entry-level developer would make here. So, and forgive me for my hourly math being off, right? But a dev here is making $100 or more an hour, and our most senior devs are $40 to $50 an hour for specialists, and we have some more junior devs now who are $30 to $40 an hour. But that's, still fractions of when you're paying $50, $60, $70, $80,000 a year. If I can get a super senior dev for $80,000 a year, that's, they're $250 here. So it is orders of magnitude smaller.
Great, thank you.
Yuri, any thoughts about why Ukraine and Nepal instead of Vietnam or Mexico?
Yeah, range-wise, I know that Ukraine would definitely be more expensive than Vietnam and that part of the world, and India. The reason why Ukraine is because Ukrainians are generally more Western-minded. So even though we're in Eastern Europe, the economy, the culture is very similar to the U.S. So it's easier to find an understanding, and which has an effect on the deliverables, right? You don't want to get a deliverable that's so wrong you don't even know where to begin. So that does have a material effect on the result.
So when you say the culture is the same as the US, you're sort of like contrasting what folks in Vietnam think about the world versus what folks in Ukraine think about the world, and they operate on different patterns.
In my experience, yeah, in my experience, it's not that Ukrainian culture is the same as the US, but Ukrainians can easily understand what the culture is like. You know, it's very because there's a Eastern and Western mindset, and Western mindset is more compartmentalized and more directed towards goals and stuff like that. So that's what Ukrainians get. So deadlines, estimates, costs, like that's easier to communicate. But in terms of even scope, when you're talking about we need to, in order to bring value, we need to be faster than our competition. What does that mean? How does it translate to database architecture and stuff like that? So in terms of that has an effect on the result.
Right.
I absolutely think that you will find cultural differences wherever you go, and without sort of making generalizations, right? One that we found was realizing that our developer who's Thai in Thailand didn't want to push back against me, right? Because he's just very nice. And I was right. I was the client. I'm not always right. And if I'm going to make a very poor decision and tell you to develop something in a way that doesn't make any sense, I need some pushback. And so I think that, you will sort of learn how to navigate some of those differences. But I know that I've sort of hammered on this point, Carol, and I think that for me, one of the best investments that you can make is investing in that middleman. I think I really walked in thinking that as an experienced product leader who had managed, like my job before I left to do the startup was a director of project management who was hired to come into a 40-person dev team and help like roll out Agile and help make sure that we could deliver effective requirements on timelines. I thought, boy, I'm ace at this. I do not need any help leading a dev team. Having a project manager and investing in a product or project manager who can make sure that your requirements are clear, that everybody's checking in, and to give your resource like this trusted middle person where they can raise issues that they may not want to raise to the client, which is a really big one. I think that is going to be money well spent.
So you just articulated the difference between being the CEO and being the project manager, right? You learned that you needed to take that part of your brain and hand it off to someone else. And that little magical decision is something that most startup people have a really hard time doing, right? I know how to do this. I can just take care of it. I'll just add it on to all of the other things that I as a CEO need to do, not remembering that I already have 3 full-time jobs as a CEO, right? I have to manage where the company's going. I have managed the culture of the company, and I've got to drive the financial outside fundraising, whatever that's going to look like. So you've already got 3 full-time jobs. That's 24 hours a day. And then adding in your dev work, and adding in your project management work just blows things up. Are there other thoughts that people want to put on the table? Paul, I'm going to give you a little magic opening here. You just stepped into the middle, came in late. What do you want to know about outsourcing? Paul's being shy. All right.
If Paul,
Hi,
hey,
Alexander.
yeah, hi everybody. Sorry for the earlier introduction. I was running from a meeting to a meeting while trying to catch this because I think this is very interesting and intriguing. So just for background, I come from the private sector, currently working in government for the city of SeaTac, and but stay very close with private sector because we attract investment to the city. Something to think about is as you are thinking about scaling, growing, and selling, is the taxes. Like taxes are there. Opportunity zones is something, if you haven't heard about, you should look into as you're looking to build a distributed team or build an organization that you may subsequently sell. Looking into opportunity zones if you haven't, and attracting investment that's capital gains tax exempt basically in the future, and reducing the capital gains tax burden is something you should look into. And of course, if you're looking to locate somewhere where you're close enough to the big city of Seattle and the others, but you don't want to be in the big city of Seattle, you can always locate in SeaTac. And then you're minutes away from the airport to get you to wherever your team is at. So I'm kind of saying that in a way of understanding how you want to position where to access to resources, because as you do that, that determines who has access to you too. And to John's point, where are your customers? Where's your supply chain? Where are your alternatives that exist? And then how does that fit into within the bigger, like now with everybody, with many businesses allowing for remote work, where do you want to locate your organization formally is a choice that hasn't been the same before as it is now, because you can actually pick and choose the best items and select that package for yourself so that you're doing things deliberately. That's one of my hypotheses, is that many organizations don't do things deliberately. You kind of end up somewhere, and versus evaluating all your options, figuring out your best, like Laura said, you have to know exactly what you're looking for. That way, you know if something fits that parameter or doesn't. And so I think this is a very exciting field. So I appreciate all the good questions and the presenter speaking. Sorry to take up some of that time, but I wanted to throw in that other view on the government side, because you inevitably run into the government somewhere or multiple times all the time. So.
And so Jess is a lone guy, hasn't quite formed his team yet. Jason has a small number of people over in Wisconsin. Bob is already split between California, Washington, and India with a small team. Chad is thinking of doing it all by himself. Tom, I don't know where you're at with your team size. I should know, but I don't know. But it's a handful of people with some outsourcing. Ken, how big are you? All these people.
Sorry, we're four. Yeah, 4 individuals, right?
Yeah. And are you co-located?
3 of us are. And then we have a developer out in the Seattle area.
Yeah. And Carol, how many people are in your company?
Just the 2 founders right now. Yeah.
And Nelson, are you still here?
Yep. So I'm still pretty early in my stages. I'm sort of the founder, but acting as a CTO at the same time. So I'm building my own MVP right now. But I'm trying to look for a solid dev or perhaps a CTO to join me with. So I'm sort of at that stage right now.
And Robert, how many people in your team?
3 for us.
Yeah, and they're co-located?
I've got one here with me in Phoenix and another one up in Seattle.
Okay, cool. And Richard, how many people on your team? Still no Richard. Michelle, I think, is outsourcing everything. And Paul, how many people on your team? Still no Paul. All right, so the thing that I get from this, and the place where I, as an economic developer, had trouble, is that the opportunity zones are really useful when you have enough resources to buy in. But we've got the onesie twosies here who are not able yet to buy a building or to put enough cash up into the system to make it go. And so that's where the economic development effort of building a coalition of people to all come together and make something go happens. And that's where, we've talked about another guy who was working on angel investing plus opportunity zones as a way to make startups go faster. But the question of taxes is interesting. If I have a distributed team or I actually have employees where one's in Phoenix and one's in South Carolina and one's in New York, and all of the HR taxes associated with that, that actually makes my head hurt. So I think that there's probably a workshop I should do on that question of how you manage the taxes for paying all those people. And if you don't know what a PEO is, it's probably worthwhile understanding what a PEO is in terms of being able to distribute all of the overhead of deploying payroll in 15 different states as you grow. Well, we're to the time of the project at the end. Is there any last words that anyone wants before we call this done? Okay, cool. Thank you so very much. Next week, we're going to talk about how to do, or what's it like to be a healthcare angel investor. So as Bob said earlier, he's part of our effort to spin up angel conferences focused on health. So we're going to start doing one workshop a month around the question of health-oriented investing and starting healthcare kinds of companies. So if you know a healthcare-oriented investor, like maybe your doctor, or a healthcare-oriented company that might like to sort of start that startup funding journey, we'd love to start getting them into that conversation. Thank you for coming. I really appreciate you being here. And Laura and Yuri, that was great. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, thanks very much for doing this, John. Take care.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.